Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to be speaking with Peter Moores and Chris Marshall. Guys, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Dan.
Yeah, good to be here.
Really excited to be speaking with you today. We're going to be talking all about coach psychology, working relationships, and probably a whole pile of stuff related to cricket psychology as well. But before we get started, let's do some introductions, some mini biographies. Peter, everybody will know you, but why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience? Just give us a mini biography.
Right, Dan. Peter Moores, one of 8 children, Catholic family. So I've got 4 brothers, 3 sisters. Educated in Macclesfield, and was lucky enough to get into England schoolboys, which then got me a sort of lift into pro cricket in 1982. So I'm celebrating my 40th year in professional cricket actually this year in some ways. And then did 16 years as a player and now 24 as a head coach. So I've been in the game a long time. Lucky enough to coach at 3 different county clubs, Sussex, Lancashire, and now at Nottingham. Was performance director at the National Academy for England, and then coached England twice. So quite a varied sort of background of coaching. And still love the game and love working with people.
Fantastic. And Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It was funny, actually, when I was thinking about the introduction today, having listened to your show, it sort of reminded me today, it's 14 years that I've been a psychologist. So 2008, I started at the EIS. Super fortunate, I felt at the time, to get a role when the EIS were putting internships in place. So I started as a sports psychology intern in 2008 and did 12 months really, just properly learning the ropes under sort of the mentorship of Pete Lindsay and Mark Bawden particularly. And then in 2009, sort of signed my first proper contract really at the IS. So I was working with Paralympic Table Tennis and Table Tennis. But through my time at the IS, I then spent most of my time with GB Boxing. So worked with GB Boxing up until 2015, which was a brilliant experience. Loved the opportunity to work at Ho Games with Pete Lindsay at that time and all the athletes there. But in that period, I worked for England Cricket. That was where I first met Morsey. We started working together in around about 2014. So cricket, went to the FA in 2018, did a couple of years with the FA, which I think I keep saying the same thing, really enjoyed. I feel really fortunate to have some of the jobs. And then, left the FA in 2018 now to be in a position where I work independently. So split my time between Nottinghamshire County Cricket Club and Wasps Rugby is where the majority of my time is spent. So, enjoy the freedom that gives me, but absolutely love being at the coalface really and working with athletes on a daily basis.
Some real eclectic experience you've got there, Chris.
Honestly, I think the grounding that I got at the English Institute of Sport, I'll never underestimate. Really, that period of time to work with a large group of psychologists, where you get unbelievable CPD, you get great sort of supervision and mentoring throughout that entire period, and you get to work with some really good athletes. So I think any psychologist that gets the chance or opportunity to work at the IS, particularly early in their career, is for me so important. But then surrounding myself in great people now, and having spent time with England Cricket and the FA, you sort of realise that the quality of people that you're around really helps you do your job well.
Well, talking about great people, coming to you, Peter, so excited and humbled to have you on talking with you. You're as experienced a coach as you're going to get, and I've followed your coaching career for many a year, and one of the things I'm thinking that you started playing cricket back in 1982 as a professional. I grew up with the England cricket team, Ian Botham, Chris Broad, Graham Dilley. That era, and I always remember. I mean, Ian Botham was a hero of mine. But as I started to get into sports psychology, as I left golf coaching behind and got into sports psychology, I think I once heard a quote from Ian Botham saying something along the lines, paraphrasing here, sports psychologists, what's the point of them? He may have changed his opinion now, but you started playing in an era where maybe sports psychology wasn't necessarily either fashionable or not even thought of back at that time. So casting your mind back to that period of time in your playing days, was sports psychology something that might have been on your radar? Did you even consider it as a thing at that time? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I first started playing, no, sports psychology is not around at all. You don't even. I think the first time you have the freedom of being young and brave and playing and just going for it. And somewhere in your career, something happens to you normally that allows doubt to grow. And then you get your experience of it. So I often now when I'm coaching, I think that first, I made a promise to myself when I got into coaching that I felt I lost my confidence 2 or 3 times as a player. And that drove me. If you ask me now, one of the biggest things I'd try and coach is how to try and help people build their own self-belief, because it's the only enemy of doubt, really. And doubt doesn't need any help at all. It's always there. When I first started playing, I knew nothing about it until really you started to question things. And the first question for me was, I got released from Worcester actually in 1984, end of 84 season. And then suddenly that created in me a whole area of, well, was I good enough? Could it be good enough? What was going to happen? And that really, then I started to challenge myself in different ways. And we see it now. We never looked, I don't think, if I'm honest, back in the day there, because coaching wasn't really, if there were coaches, they weren't coaching the same way as people do now. There was a strength in that independence. You had to grow up quick and learn from the environment around yourself. But what's available to a player now, I think, is some really good information, which they can use to really help themselves manage themselves really in what is a high pressure arena they're going to go into if they're going to be successful. Because you can't win any trophies without going through pressure moments. And you certainly can't go and achieve the things you want to achieve without being able to handle pressure and being able to deliver in it. And we hear those comments of go and express yourself, just go and relax. And they mean nothing really to anybody unless you have some sort of strategy to go out there and be able to play and do those things, which I think the first acceptance is the player is it's not easy to do.
When was your first exposure to sports psychology? Or sports psychologists, I should ask.
Well, I suppose my first exposure to a lot of things was in '97. I was captain of Sussex, and I got asked I'd coached quite a bit actually, but I got asked to go to Bradford Management Centre. It was a pilot thing by the ECB back in the day, and on the whole of that sort of 2 or 3 days. I had learned and heard things that I'd never really heard before, and I remember driving back down the M1 back to Sussex thinking really how dumb I'd been, because there was things out there I knew nothing about at all. But it lit a passion in me then. I was still a player, but to start to explore some of them, not all of them, but some of them. And then when I became a coach in '98. I was a player coach into a full-time coach. Straight away then I wanted to explore the area a little bit, because it was an area that I felt we could get one of the bigger moves. And Steve Bull was one of the first people who was then a younger psych in some ways into cricket and to do some work, which seems a long time ago now. But at that point, he helped. I remember him helping me a little bit towards the end of the last part of my career in this challenge of changing. I was a wicketkeeper who batted and captained, and trying to find a way of leaving one of those things behind, like keeping, and suddenly start batting. How was I going to do that? And he gave me some strategies, and it worked straight away. So in that way, I was sold that there was areas we could go. And in my time as a coach, I've always if I'm honest, I don't think I've actually found that many, what I would say, really good sports psychs all the time. You can't always find a good sports psych. I think there's much more now than there was back then. It was hard. But I still think as a head coach now, I want to be quite fussy about the sort of sports psych I bring into an environment that I'm coaching, because I think it's got to fit fit the setup and fit the coaching stuff and the way we're going about what we're trying to achieve.
Is the guy sitting next to you a good sports psych?
In my opinion, yes. No, it's a really, for Marshy's been great. I've known Chris now quite a long time. But one of the things I like about sports psych is a sports psych who's, I'd say, proactive, who looks for work. And I don't mean that in a pushy, not to be pushy with people, but I sort of see proactive as the opposite of passive. And I think if psych goes wrong, you're waiting for something to go wrong to help somebody rather than actually adding to the environment all the time, looking to help people go about their everyday business in a better way. And that can be interacting with their teammates. It can be how they go about their skill. It can be interacting with coaches and how coaches interact with players. So this development of understanding of everybody in the setup is a huge part of it. And often just being around, immersed in somewhere, so you can sense somebody needs to talk, maybe not to a coach, but to somebody slightly outside of that where there is a level of confidentiality, they can offload, they can get frustration out, helping our setup, certainly not, run smoother and clearer with a better understanding of each other, of how to get the best out of each other.
Well, you've started to unpack for us there, Peter, very eloquently, the potential relationship between a coach and a psychologist. And coming to you, Chris, Peter talks there about being the importance of a sports psychologist being proactive. Before we do a detailed dive, a granular dive here in terms of how you guys might work together, how you both feel this works best in terms of your relationship, in terms of a psychologist embedding themselves into a coaching culture, an organizational culture. Let's begin at the beginning. I mean, how did this relationship start between the two of you, Chris? How did you meet? You mentioned earlier that you met Peter at England, but how did it start at Notts County Cricket Club? And what kind of conversations did you have at the beginning that started off your work there?
I think referencing the time at England together is quite important, actually, because if we think about relationships are often built by time spent with each other, and you often go through things together, which tightens stuff or doesn't tighten, actually. But I think in our instance, it probably tightens stuff. So when I was at the EIS, actually, I left GB boxing in 2013, actually, and I left disability table tennis, in 2013, and my ECB contract started actually initially whilst I was at the EIS. It wasn't until 2015 when I became employed by England Cricket. And around about 2014, Mark Bawden, who was the psychologist with England Cricket at the time, had sort of initiated to Pete the conversation that he wanted to step away from travelling with the first team. He'd done it for a long period of time. It's a difficult role, a lot of time away from family. Bawd's had some young children at the time. And I think it suggested to Pete, look, we've got a couple of psychologists that are in the system, myself being one of them. And Pete had said, look, let's Chris come to a couple of management meetings, and if it feels like there's a decent fit in there, then we've got a tour to Sri Lanka, one day series to Sri Lanka, and Chris can come on that tour. So went to the management meeting, obviously said a few things that Morsey liked, and we found ourselves in a position where it's like, look, currently working for the ECB, makes complete sense, go on that tour. So went on the tour. Things seemed to go pretty well. Built reasonable relationship with players, but started to build some good relationships with the coaching staff. And then we obviously went through to the 2015 World Cup, which didn't go the way that any of us would have wanted it to go. But in that period of difficulty, like Pete and I found ourselves in conversations where we just built a relationship when stuff was tough. I'd like to think that Pete would say I was a useful sounding board for him through that period. And our sort of friendship and relationship really, really grew from there. Pete left his role at England Cricket at that point, and I stayed and carried on working in the pathway. But when it became sort of obvious to me, or Pete had mentioned to me that there's a role at Nottinghamshire, was I interested in potentially stepping into that space? For me, I was really excited to come and work with Pete again, but also there were a lot of players here at Notts that I'd worked with when I was at England. So a lot of early relationships were there. So actually coming into this space, it was, I wouldn't say easy, no job's ever easy, but there were some starting points that I already had because there were conversations that I could pick up that were historical. But as a psychologist, my sort of therapeutic framework is built around acceptance and commitment therapy. So that's where a lot of my work is grounded in. Social constructivism would absolutely be where I see the world. And I think simply, I just want to increase psychological flexibility in players. Like that's what I see. I want people to be able to stay in the present moment for longer. I want them to do things that matter to them. But ultimately, I want the system to be really good at developing people. So whether that's coaches helping coaches, players helping players, coaches helping players, players helping coaches, whatever it looks like, we have a bit of a saying here, which is all built around, we just want people to bring the best version of themselves to work. And when Pete and I were planning to come on here today, one of the things we spoke about is it helps when your coach and your psychologist are on exactly the same page. And this idea of people being the best version of themselves is something that I've noticed in Pete ever since I've worked with him. And it's just something I think is a simple thing to go after. And because it's not just Pete and I, it's everybody at Notts. We go after that together. And that's what I think why it works so well.
When you say, and it's a question for either of you, when you say on the same page, the coach and the psychologist on the same page, be specific for me there. What do you mean? What does that page consist of for both of you?
Well, I mean, I think for me, when you put your staff together, you I think you tend to attract like-minded people anyway. I think just by nature. I mean, I think from an overall view of how you get the best out of somebody. So I believe pretty strongly when I say the best version, there's a self-interest to that because I want to win. I'm competitive.
Okay.
But I see winning as a byproduct of improvement. So the reality of it is the best way I think we win is our players become more skillful as practitioners, batters, bowlers, fielders. I think they become more robust at being able to handle pressure, tougher, resilience, whichever way you want to put it. They develop all those skills to become, and because they've learnt really the key area of self-awareness of themselves and each other and whatever, that fundamentally means that they can survive pressure situations because they can start to understand how they react in different situations. Now, to do that, I need somebody else who sees it in a similar way. And as a support staff now, as a coaching team, and definitely for Chris as our psych, that idea of building self-awareness. And when I say self-awareness, I understand you're not going to get it overnight. There's got to be some sort of that's why I think immersing yourself as a psych in an environment makes such a difference, because you actually catch people doing things brilliantly and badly. And that's where a lot of that learning comes from. Do you realise X happened? And I include coaches in that. I could have an example where I say something to a player, Chris might come to me, you do realise I think maybe you got that wrong by the reaction you just got from it. Well, in that moment, it can be nipped in the bud. I can either disagree or agree, but actually often I'll find me saying, yeah, you've got a good point. Now, I might have known that deep down, but decided to ignore it. But because somebody nudges you, you tend to then say, well, I'll go and find him and say, listen, and quite rightly, maybe go to place, listen, I think I got that wrong. I'm sorry, mate. I didn't mean it come out quite like that. It was more like this. And a potential incident is already cut off before it's even started. So the same page for me is you're viewing really how are we going to be competitive? Because we're a professional setup. We have to achieve.
Yep.
But what does achievement look like? What does success look like? So, for me, growth is success. I can't really control if we win the league or not. What I can hopefully try and create is that the environment is one where it has the capacity to allow people to grow in. And that means it has a level of protection in it for you to be brave, to make decisions, make mistakes if you need to. It has a psychological safety in there that you're in, and we're going to look after you. And with that, we want you to be brave to go out and play. So suddenly expression becomes a more realistic thing to do now, because actually you're sort of amongst friends and you're getting good advice. And when things go wrong, the reaction you get from the staff is consistent, and we can move somewhere. Now, that I think me and Chris see the same thing there, and that to me is there's layers. I realise as a coach what I can deliver, and there's certain areas I can be strong on, and there's certain areas that the expertise of where Chris is coming from is going to add so much benefit to the player and to the coaching staff. And it's sort of like on a one-to-one basis, but also on a team basis, and small group basis. It can be whichever way it sort of falls.
And I'll be honest, I can't add more. I can't add much more than that. I think the thing I'd add to, I think, is in environments where this works well, we are on the same page a lot of the time. And if I think about Mustafa Sarkar's work as an example, there is high challenge as well. So whilst there is a high amount of agreement and we do see the world quite similarly, we're actually quite open to say, no, I'm not sure you're getting that right. And actually having a pretty robust debate about the way we're seeing the world. And then ultimately, I think the role as a psychologist is I will offer my perspective within the boundaries of confidentiality, what I can share of what I might know about a player. And I will share that with my head coach, with my coaches. But then ultimately, it's their call whether they act on that information or not. And that is super, super important to me, is that you build a relationship where you can share information that's appropriate to share, offer some advice in certain areas, but then ultimately you are a member of support staff. And that, I think, is important to remember.
I want to return to that notion of psychological safety and high challenge in a second. I just want to reflect back some of the things I think I've heard. You both coach in an environment that exists to win, an organisation that exists to win because it's professional sport, but you both recognise, and Peter, you recognise that to be able to win, winning is a byproduct of, let's say, cliche as it is, getting the processes right. And interestingly, Chris, you spoke a little bit earlier about your approach and ACT, acceptance, commitment therapy, and social constructivism, and all the kind of long words that we use as psychs to complicate things. But that's your lens of the world, and where you feel you can add a great deal of value from a people perspective. When we came to filling in that sheet from you, Peter, you talked about essentially skill and performance under pressure. I want players to grow their skill. I want them to be robust under pressure. So it feels like when you fuse those two together, Chris, and it's not to suggest, Peter, that you don't have people skills, because as a coach you clearly will have, and it's not to suggest, Chris, that you don't have an interest in specific mental skills related to cricket, because you do have. But there feels like there's both a dichotomy and a complementarity here, whereby, Peter, you're looking at the lens through a skill and a performance perspective. Chris, you're always looking at the lens here through the lens of a people perspective, and those kind of fuse together to create this relationship. Is that garbled nonsense, or have I kind of?
If you get the word dichotomy in there, it can't be. You nail it. But yeah, I think contrast in. So Marshy once said to me, I said, to keep one of the roles Marshy plays is you keep the mental side of preparation, the mental side of performance, the well-being of players on the map. It stays relevant, because the danger is sometimes we can get washed over with getting sucked into the outcomes and whatever, and we forget about some of those things that go in there. So the development of the person himself or herself fundamentally is crucial, because without good people, you don't win things, and you don't do. But you're right. I look at it from a point of view. I love my players. I always have done, because I think it's the only way I can gain that trust to be able to challenge enough to help push them to get somewhere. It's not that dissimilar in some ways to parenting, when for me, coaching's about seeing what could be rather than what is, what somebody could be. And then hopefully they see the same. And between the two of you, and a team you get excited where you could go to, and then it's no longer work. It's now an excitement. It's a journey, whatever you want to call it. All those words that get used a bit too much, but actually it becomes something different because we're on a bit of a mission to get somewhere.
Peter, I was going to ask you, I mean, do you kind of utilise Chris from a sense of a groundedness perspective? Because, you know, in coaching, we're so socialised into X's and the O's, if we're going to use that term, or we're so socialised into outcomes and high performance that actually having somebody by your side who's kind of saying, yeah, great, fantastic, and it's really important. We work very hard to attain this performance, but we've also got to look at this through the lens of well-being and mental health as well. It's like somebody there just grounding you around people skills.
Absolutely. I think that it's a key role that we look at. You know, I often say for me as a head coach, somebody once gave me advice, change the lens you look at things through if you want to start to get insight on the different things. And one of the lenses is to look at, the general well-being of your players. So I would look at players. One, are they enjoying themselves? Do they seem relaxed? Are they distracted? All those things are areas as a coach I can help look at, but realistically, Chris is looking at the players all the time like that. And that to me is, I think the environment we're creating, I am one of the guardians of that environment. Everybody is, but I also see Chris as in many ways on the support staff of the other guardian, the two main guardians, the head coach and the psych, as you protect and guard that environment, in that if we are serious about saying we want growth and improvement and enjoyment to be the norm in there, then it needs some protection if someone's getting it slightly wrong, and not for that feedback to be given in a way that is, it's got to be clean, it's got to be done in a private way often, but that will help us all move forward, coaches and players.
Just on that, there's something that one of the principles we operate to here, which is something that is quite important to me, is the notion of look inside first. And what I mean by that is, if we're observing a player or a member of staff or whatever it be, and it's like actually, their behaviours feel like it's a bit inconsistent at the moment, or it feels different from the norm. One of the best questions for me that we try and ask now as a group of staff is, I wonder what's going on for that player at the moment. And also then, actually, what are we doing in the environment which is maybe preventing them from thriving? What maybe is it that we're doing in this environment which is preventing us from seeing the best version of them? And one of the reasons I've always enjoyed that way of looking at the world, and it's something that I must admit the staff here are really, really good at doing now, is it actually gives you a little bit more control back in how you might shape stuff, rather than, the player doesn't get it or that member of staff doesn't get it. It's like, well, how are we framing stuff which means that they don't get it, rather than blame over that way. And I think having those lenses and helping to, Pete's alluded to, educate the whole system, players and staff, around how we want to go about our business as a group, feels the most psychologically informed way to do things. And hopefully it pays off, and it pays off by winning stuff.
Well, the two things I wrote down there, Chris, as you were speaking, was PI, the acronym for Psychologically Informed Environment, where we take into account the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences and the personalities of the players that we're dealing with. And the other thing I wrote down, which I think really, for me, in my opinion, I'd like to get your opinion here, Chris, goes hand in hand with the PI, is that notion of an internal locus of control, that we are looking to ourselves first. A consultancy position I had once, I felt that certainly during good times, the coaching staff had an internal locus of control, and then the playing staff had an internal locus of control. So by that, I mean, they both look to themselves first rather than externalizing blame on the others. And that's got to be the divine elixir, isn't it? It's like, if both sets, the playing staff, the coaching staff, are looking to themselves first for problems, solutions, answers, etc., that's a very powerful place to be. But that starts, in my opinion, with that PI, that psychologically informed environment, Chris.
Yeah, it really does. And everyone's on their own journey towards that. And I think Pete's alluded to it. We just want to see growth. actually, are we getting a little bit closer to that each week? And as part of that growth, there's going to be a few dips along the way, and some people are going to have things that happen to them in their life and also in their sport, which maybe take them away from that. But it's why I always try and have in my mind, and apologies for repeating myself, I suppose, is, am I helping players understand, are they doing what matters to them? Can they stay in the present moment? And actually, can we open up and be vulnerable? And that just ultimately sits with what I believe to be true with regards to helping broader development of people. And actually, that's notwithstanding, Dan, the idea that we also want to help people develop skill. So are we teaching visualization? Are we working with players on breathing strategies to manage pressure? Are we helping players have great pre-performance routines? Are we thinking about psychological recovery? All that stuff is on our radar. But I actually think that comes second to that broadening sense of self-awareness and what we've talked about here, which is creating an environment for players to just be the best version of themselves.
With those mental skills, that's another thing I want to come back to in a minute, because I do want to explore that, but I do agree with you. We've got to put the wider environment in place first. Coming to you, Peter, as I was talking about internal locus of control, it made me think of this 40 years of experience you've got within cricket as a player and then as a coach. If you think about that idea of players taking responsibility, coaches taking responsibility, so both sets take responsibility, look to themselves first. I mean, have you experienced, I don't know if you agree with that, so it would be interesting to hear from you there. And have you experienced in the past where things potentially have broken down at a club, whether it's in a playing position that you've had or a coaching position, where, I don't know, players blame coaches, coaches blame players? Do you think that's actually quite a big thing that can happen, and that can be a real forerunner for breakdown at a club?
I think the blame game is probably the commonest form of breakdown in sport. Players to coaches, coaches to players. So the look inside first is fundamental, I think, to have a successful setup. I think where all this starts is we hear people say things, give players autonomy, quite rightly so, take responsibility, lines like that. The key is they need skills to do that. And that's what Chris is talking about. You need skills. So I think my experience tells me the way the world is now, it keeps changing. The players keep changing. The world keeps changing. And when I first started, environments and cultures sort of grew organically because you were together all the time. You weren't being pulled around by everything else. So if you ask how we run it here, how I think it runs now, to run a sports team, you celebrate the individual. It's about the individual now. You celebrate because that fits what I would say where society is. And by doing that, you don't do that in a way that says we're not also celebrating the team and everybody together. But the acceptance of, to have a strong individual agenda is normal. It's a normal thing to have. The rule within teams, it can't go above the team's agenda. The team agenda is going to be above that. But for you to have a strong personal agenda in your own success, your own development, your own moves forward, I think is absolutely a motivator for you. And also that celebrating you is, how do we help you develop into become the best version of you? And the best version being one that can work within teams, be successful, be humble when you need to be, have a strong enough personality to impress yourself on a game of cricket or football or whatever it is at the right times. They're all things you develop. And I think what we've seen here, or I've seen certainly over my last 5 or 6 years, with the things that are available now, the feedback systems that created, having a good psych, you can move really fast now as a person. And I think if you do, you can start to really see the impact that can have when you go and do something that's very public like sport.
Do you think, though, Pete, I mean, to maybe slightly challenge all of our positions here, do you think that, because reflecting back on virtually your first answer to me when you were thinking back on your career, you talked about how at that time you personally had to find answers for you. Yep. Do you think there's a danger that with podcasts like this, with other podcasts, with all the literature that we have available to us, with the internet, with coaching building these systems, these support systems, that players might feel dependent or reliant on those systems, that it might lessen player responsibility to seek out answers themselves. You use that word autonomy, I understand that, but that's a tension for coaches, perhaps, that they've got to find that balance between offering support, but also holding back and allowing players to find their own answer as well. Otherwise, it can become a dependency culture.
Absolutely, I think, Dan, you couldn't be more on the. If a coach gets that wrong, then you spoon feed players or whatever you want to do. The setup is not working. Growth comes because we know you make mistakes. You have to find answers out yourself. One of the big things that happen, I think, now is the amount of information that out there is huge, and often you're trying to help. Certainly, the hungry players to decipher some of that stuff and what it is, because they can take snapshots, they can take little bits of it and not really get the full story. So I think you've got to be really careful, and I think that's going to split the quality of the coach or the setup, really. If it's, coaches are like any other profession. You get good coaches, bad coaches, average coaches, coaches in form, coaches out of form. Same as, I think, anybody in support staff, same as players. We're normal, we're human. Providing everybody's got that thing that the look inside first is your protection in many ways. I think that you have to find your own answers, and we're going to help you do that. As a coach, I'm not here to give you the answer. I'm here to help you find and be enthusiastic around you to get the options as part of it. And also, there is a judge that goes in professional sport, and it's the game. It's not the coach. The game itself helps do that judging for you, because if you're performing well, then it's telling you getting a lot of things right. If your teammates are interacting well with you, then you're fitting well within the group. And I think, again, someone like having Chris around, if someone's finding themselves isolated, upset, not happy, then something's not right. Either we're not dealing with that person right, or they're finding some challenges to interact. But it can be dealt with, I think. And I think that responsibility has to lie both with coaches and with the players.
Peter, you mentioned there's so much information available in books, online, on the internet, on courses, podcasts, etc. And coming to you, Chris, I mean, so often now I'm talking with coaches and describing myself as a sense maker or sense giver around the biopsychosocial aspects or component of sport underpinning the technical, tactical and physical. And so that you may see that as a big part of your role. And I suppose in line with that, coming back to this psychological safety and talking about a culture of high challenge and talking about challenging each other. I mean, Chris, Peter's your boss. How on earth can you challenge your boss? How can you tell your boss that, in this instance, he might be wrong? And I'm asking this question, and I've got in mind an audience listening in who are sports scientists, physios, etc., who all work in sports, who might find it challenging to challenge the people who are maybe who might be seen as above them. So I suppose my question there is, well, how do you go about that? Is that sort of a negotiation you've both put in place? And do you have any tips for people out there, Chris, as to how to challenge others?
Well, typically an unoaked red wine helps. On a serious note, I think before I get to the challenge bit, I would like to say one thing. Yeah. You talked about sense maker there for a second. Yeah. Mark Bawden, actually, and Pete Lindsay, who I mentioned earlier on, are sort of two of the real key developers in my life, really. Often talked about how...
Yeah, two big psychologists they were at the English Institute of Sport, weren't they?
Yeah, correct. And now have a company called Mindflick. Actually, they both talked about and helped me understand this idea of players having super clarity on their method. What is your method? So that you can use your method as a filter for all the information that comes in. So whether that be your technical method, your psychological method, where does your confidence come from? All of that, you can use that as the filter for everything that comes in. And that's where I'd see part of my role is helping players understand what that might look like for them. But on the challenging piece, like honestly, it's always so much easier to do if you've got evidence. And evidence, never forget like the behavioural bits and evidence that you might see. So I might say, look, at his best, you see this in this human being. They're quite chirpy, they're quite loud, they're quite happy to be around. I've noticed that over the last few days they've been a little bit quiet, or you've seen something different in their normal character. I've also looked, and I'll probably also say things like, I've also just observed an interaction where you were pretty hard on them in that instance. Like, was that your intention? And because if your intention matched your behaviour, absolutely brilliant. But if we then step into that conversation, it then just becomes quite curious. I've noticed this. What do you think? Are we getting the best version at the moment? And how do we work from there? But I'd also say is I've got a leader here that role models challenge. So he will provide challenge, he will accept challenge. And that then also makes it a hell of a lot easier. So the question that you asked was, what's the advice that you would give here? Is first and foremost, if you are a leader that's listening to this, like, how good are you at receiving feedback? Because if you are hard to give feedback to, it's unlikely that people are going to give you any feedback. So that's a really, really important starting point. So if you're a leader listening to this, how great do you think you are at receiving feedback? And secondly, if you're going to provide a little bit of feedback or a bit of challenge, make sure you've got some decent evidence. And that can be behavioural evidence, it can be data, whatever it may be, because then it becomes a lot harder to agree or disagree when you've got some decent evidence. So those are a couple of bits that will be on my mind, I think.
So coming to you, Peter, were you always good at receiving feedback? Have you improved? If so, how?
I think you get better. I do think you get better. And normally by being around really good people. I think this whole idea of when I first started coaching, I thought I had to have all the answers. If I'm honest, I felt you shouldn't show any weakness a little bit and whatever. And over time, you start to understand you don't know the answers. It's okay to be vulnerable. You can actually tell people, I'm not quite sure. I think I cocked that one up. Because you do. That's real. And I think if you're more like that, then you're more likely to get the feedback. But I also find I actually ask people for it and say, listen, it's okay. Give me what you think. I might be getting right or wrong, and just get a view. I honestly don't think I was like that before. I think the more content you get in with your own style as a coach, the more you're happy to get feedback on it, knowing that you will adjust it if you think it needs adjusting. And that the version you are at the moment might need adjusting because the world keeps changing. People keep changing. You can only work with what you have at the time. And I think that, so yeah, sometimes you don't like it. I think everybody's got to accept that feedback can be quite tough at times. And we get it in different ways. I think Chris is right. If it's evidence-based, if it's given in a way that often, Chris might say to me, listen, I've got something for me, do you want to chat about it or not? And then you have a choice of whether you want to get it or not, and whether you want to get it there and then. And you might say, listen, okay, I'll go have coffee tomorrow morning. And then you've got a bit of time ready to get it. But as soon as you know somebody's got something, human nature means I'm quite curious to know what it is. And I think the more you can take the emotion out of that feedback, the better.
Human nature drives curiosity. Doesn't human nature drive pushback as well? Do you have to deal with that? Do you have to deal with that voice inside your head thinking, I've got 40 years in cricket, what do you know about that?
Oh yeah, all the time. I think honestly that there's part of you that thinks I was right, but often I'll say to most people, deep down when something wasn't quite right often. And if the feedback's given at that time, you start to trust the sort of feedback you're getting. So I'll know, if you ask me, we've had a chat to a player or I've spoke to a group, if it was good or bad or indifferent, I'd normally have a pretty good idea. If I've spoke to a player and I'm thinking, it didn't quite go, I wanted it to. If Chris is listening to it or somebody else said, listen, I'm not sure you did quite right, it just helps really you clarify in your head that you should probably do something about it and not just ignore the fact that actually, because I think what I've understood over time is players know everything. They know everything about everything. Yes. And if you are not being fair or straight with them or right with them or whatever, then it's going to hurt them and it'll hurt you over time. So you've got to get open. You've got to speak to them. You've got to make sure that it's okay to say, listen, listen, we just had a chat. It came out wrong, I think. This is what I'm trying to get across to you here. Because then the player starts to understand, yes, you are human. You're trying to be honest. Sometimes the feedback you're giving them, it's not that easy to get across. And you're trying to make sure they're clear. And sometimes the follow-up of that information I can use, Chris, and say, listen, I've had a chat with somebody. It was quite a hard chat. I need to know where they're sitting with it, really, without giving away any confidentialities. Go and have a chat and let's see where we're at and see if they're understanding where we're coming from. Because really, at the end of the day, the longer you get a relationship with somebody, hopefully they start to see there's only one intention here. That's to try and help them get better, to achieve more, to have more happiness, not just at the game, in life in general.
Chris, if a coach might be thinking, I've got 40 years in this game, what do you know about it? Do you ever experience the opposite, which might be considered as imposter syndrome? Well, the only time I've played cricket was when I was 11 years old and I got bowled out for a golden duck or whatever. I don't feel worthy here. I don't feel that I can influence here.
I definitely took a better game as a cricketer than I was, by the way. So, any of my mates or something like, yeah, you weren't that great, but the lads here think I was brilliant. I think
you're a good salesman as well.
I think honestly, I want people to be vulnerable, to be able to share with me stuff that's going through their minds. So if I'm not willing to role model that, I think I'm getting something wrong. So quite often, if the coach asks me for something, I'll say, look, this is just what I'm seeing. And I might be right, I might be wrong, but let me just provide you with something which I think might help. And I don't think you can go far wrong if you take that approach. I really don't, because it's all about, we just want people to get better. And when I say get better, it's just improve at their skill, achieve what they want to achieve for what they set out when they were 5-6 years old and they decided that I want to be a football player or a rugby player, and they found themselves fortunate enough to do it. If I genuinely believe that when people feel comfortable to be themselves, can openly talk, can share, then I probably need to do that as well. I mean, I get imposter syndrome as much, if not more than most people. We all get it. We all sit with it and go, can I really offer in this place? And I think the practicalities of that is I'm effectively 3 days a week here at Nottinghamshire, so I'm around quite a bit. But in the contracts I've had that aren't as much as that, just being really clear in that early contracting on what you want from me helps. So when a coach says to me, Chris, I'd really value giving us some feedback on how you see us interacting, that kind of opens my door to say, you asked for this, so I'm going to give you some. If a coach says, I want you to do a role which is very player focused, I want you to help our players develop our mental skills, get better at the sport, and I'm less bothered about you giving me some feedback on our interactions, that's fine. I then have to make a decision whether I want to do that role or not, because it feels a little bit away from the type of role I prefer to do. But also, I know exactly where my boundaries are. And it can be, I've said this and I've spoken about this a few times on a few other things that I've done. The early contracting can feel hard work, can feel clunky, but it makes your job so much easier when you know what conversations you really can step into and maybe which ones you've just got to hang fire on until there's some trust somewhere for you to do that.
I think just on interested on Marshy doing his role and giving feedback and stuff like that. The one thing, personal view, and I get it from my conversations with players, is I have to hear in very different formats from players things like, oh, I like Marshy, or I like whoever the site might be, because he doesn't try to sports psych me. And that means that he doesn't try and psych me, so I don't get booked to one-to-one meeting and to become and tell it. Basically, they see him around training, they see him all the time, and then something happens and say, well, should go and have a coffee about it. And it feels more organic, that actually here's somebody around, and actually I can now, let's go and talk about this, and because the timing is right. And I think there's a real challenge, I think, operating within sporting environments where time is tight sometimes, of booking somebody into somebody as if to say, I'm going to make you better today by doing this. Because what happens to the player, they put their defences up if they're not careful. And it becomes quite a difficult conversation rather than one that is nearly generated from the player himself to say, should we just have a chat about this, see if we can move it? And then suddenly there's something happening. And I think that's where I feel often for sports sites and setups, actually, you need enough time to immerse yourself in so it doesn't feel like you're actually somebody different in the environment. You're actually, Marsh is in today or he's not in today at training, and it feels very normalised. And with that, talking about mental skills or individually or group becomes normal. Breathing techniques becomes quite a normal conversation.
So with that in mind, Peter, and this could be a question to either of you and to both of you, if the psych is the person who hangs around and
good description,
players
good description,
yeah. If Marshy hangs around and players see him there and opt to go and see him when they want him, how do we differentiate between needs and wants? Because a player who doesn't want something might actually need something. How do you negotiate that?
I think what's really important here is it's not just me doing sports psychology in the environments that I work in. So a player may not quite want to do some work for whatever reason, but we alluded earlier about like mental skills, for example. As our fast bowling coach here at Nottinghamshire, Kevin Shine, does better mental skills delivery than me. So actually, from that point of view, I'm more than happy for a player to be delivered to have quality mental skill support from our fast bowling coach. And it might be that I'm just working to upskill my fast bowling coach in order to help him deliver that piece of work. So I think for me, when you've got a bit of time in a system, and time can be a day a week if it's really consistent and there's a consistency to what that looks like. When you've got time in a system where we talked about psychologically informed environments, helping the whole system deliver psychological support that makes me just as excited as sitting down with a player and going, "Oh, this feels like a really chunky piece of work we want to get into to help you achieve your goals." If it's me doing it, amazing. If it's the other staff that are doing it as well, that's just as good for me.
Yeah, I mean, going to specific to that question, I think I totally agree. What a player wants and what he needs are fundamentally two different things, often. So I think you've got to be really careful here. That's why I like a proactive psych, because they're looking to do work. So you don't hang around. You're looking for opportunities, windows to get in with people. Also, the need for something often comes because they get feedback, clear evidence. And that to me is so, our environment is not, it can sound a bit woolly, just want to be the best version of yourself. No, it can be highly measured, very disciplined, very organised. And in that, there's an autonomy. So we create what I would say areas of excellence where you go working, but in that you're expected to work with an intensity and a work rate to do that, of which you might be stretching yourself and it might not work for you, but there'll be support systems around for you. You can come out of that environment, relax and do something different and get feedback off different people, and then move into another one and do some work over there. But that idea of you start to understand the way you develop as a person. If you just want things you like all the time, you're not stretching yourself at all. Well, that environment's not right because you're not understanding what it is you need to do. And to get that, going back quite a long time now, when I first came, 17, we were starting to develop ourselves as a group with Stuart Broad in our setup. And Stuart brought with us this whole understanding of, I don't think we take feedback very well. I remember in England, I had to go through this and it started to do. And that when a senior player is saying something like that, it starts to land with players. Actually, I have to look at this a little bit of how am I going to do it? And it doesn't mean we don't get knocked back. We do. Often when you do something like this, it sounds like everything always goes really smooth. It doesn't. We end up with moments that are awkward at times, somebody not challenging themselves enough. But, when people talk about trust in an environment, the trust and safety of an environment is the only thing that allows challenge to feel like challenge, which is fun, and not judgment, which is horrible. So I want our players to come to work feeling it's great because I get challenged. I get judged by the game. I get challenged in practice. There's a difference. If I come to practice and I feel like I'm being judged every second of the day, then I'm not, because basically I'm not stretching myself there now. I'm trying to survive practice. And that's not going to make me into what I would say is an expressive sportsman when I go out and play, because most of my practice is gained about trying to get through it. And I don't want that. We do practices where it's about execution only, and then there has to be a huge discipline, and there's practice where you can start to stretch your game. So there's a difference. But that understanding of for players as they come in over time is what goes with a sophisticated sportsman or woman, whichever way.
I'm mindful of your time. I've got a couple more questions. Chris, you said we're all invested here in terms of helping people, players get better, improve. How do you negotiate, manage your way through confidentiality? Because you've both talked about the importance of vulnerability. I mean, is there the need for confidentiality? When is there the need for confidentiality? What does that look like? How do you negotiate that at Notts Cricket Club? Obviously, respecting any confidentiality yourself that you have for how you go about doing what you do.
Yeah, look, it's. I hate to say it, it's quite simple in my mind, in that we operate a way that is, if players want confidentiality, they just have to ask for it. And they all sign informed consent when they start work with me right at the beginning. And players know that if they want to talk to me about stuff that they don't want the whole system being aware of, that option is absolutely there for them. And I have to say, not once does it ever get challenged by any of the staff that I'm around. Staff might say to me, how is X? And I'll say, look, they're absolutely fine, but they want to keep some stuff confidential at the moment. Done. And the conversation pretty much stops. But there are times when in those moments I might say, it would be really useful actually if I could share this with a couple of the coaches, maybe your specialist coach in your area, because that will help them make sense a little bit about where you are. And then it just becomes the player's decision. And the player might say, yeah, actually, Marshy, that would be really helpful. Or they'll say, actually, no, can we keep that off the radar? And of course, that is absolutely fine. For me, that's how it works. We try not to make it too complicated, because we want to create space where people feel safe to go, I've got some psychological support which can be completely confidential, which is here. But then they also know that the performance element of my role is I want to really support coaches understand players better, players understand coaches better, help them develop their skill. And there are going to be elements within that where player conversations will happen.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, from my perspective, I remember once trying to bring in what could be to systemize it in a manner whereby there was a kind of a traffic light system where I tried to lean the organization towards anything that was performance related, like mental skills, essentially, was the green light. Like, we're all involved here. There's really no need for any kind of confidentiality. The amber light being, I suppose, a little bit of sort of day-to-day maladaptive thinking and unhelpful thinking, and if somebody said, I really want this to be confidential, that's fine, but kind of encouraging players to be more open and vulnerable about those things, because it shouldn't negatively impact their participation within the organisation. And there may be space for that red light, if you like, something that's a little bit more pressing from a welfare and a mental health perspective. So no question.
And look, and we like in all the environments that I work in now, we mental health screen 3 times a year. That is held between being myself and the doctor. Any work that can be done within my skill set stays within the club. If not, we'll contract in somebody. The coaching staff know that happens, but they don't know the specifics of it, because they recognise it's an important part of helping players be the best version of themselves, and it's something that we manage between myself and the doc.
I also think a lot of the mental skills routines and stuff like that I agree, you don't always need confidentiality, and I expect coaches to deliver and be in dialogue with players anyway on that sort of stuff, be it breathing, pre-performance. They should, to be a decent operator as a coach, you're going to have conversations about players around that anyway, I think. So they should be in the loop, and if anything outside of that the player doesn't want, I think Chris is right. Hopefully the coach shouldn't challenge, and if he does, that has to come to me, I think, to say, well, why?
Yeah.
You know, there has to be some level of trust there because our setup is based on trust. Because we want to be able to challenge, because without challenge, we can't improve. Without improvement, we don't grow. And without growth, we stagnate and we're dead in the water.
Well, that's a neat segue to my very final question today, that mental skills piece. Now, a word that you have consistently used throughout this conversation, Peter, is expressive or expressive sportsman. Is that the kind of the epitome of what you want from a mental skills piece, the capacity to, personally, in my experience, one of the most destructive mindsets for a player to be in is in an inhibited mindset. You could call that fearful or anxious, or the antithesis of confident, I suppose. And in psychological terms, we might talk about approach behavior, front foot. Expressive feels very much the same. What to you is an expressive cricketer?
Well, if I explain mindset, there's sort of two mindsets to me that go with pro sport. One, you want to perform in it, and one, you want to survive it.
Yep.
Surviving something never works, really. You might delay it, but it doesn't. The higher the level you go up, the worse it gets. So trying not to make mistakes at low levels actually give you some reward sometimes by being a safe player. The higher up a chain in sport you go, the less you get back, and the more you've got to let go. So in cricket terms, probably up to second team level, you might do okay by being a batter who wants to not get out, for instance. Until you're a batter who looks to score runs, then you need that at first team level, you need it at test match level. A bowler who looks to not go for runs and not take wickets will suddenly get found out later on. A fielder who tries to not miss the ball or not make a mistake rather than attack it and be aggressive will get found out. So a lot of what I'm trying to do with players, along with the coaches and with Chris, is to develop that mindset. How do I realistically enjoy the fact that the pressure is on, but I can stay in a mindset that wants to perform and show off in a way. Now, what my method is, I might be a batter who wants to basically bat time, but I do that in the positive nature that I'm wearing them down, so we'll attack you later. But everything's got that way of looking at it, not I'm doing this because I'm not good enough to do anything else, and I'm just going to try and survive and get through. And that to me is this expression really is when the best version of somebody comes out. The one we see at times in practice comes out in the main arena, and we see them in rhythm. I think rhythm is something that's not talked enough about in sport, and rhythm is easier to see than people give it credit for. Rhythm, the right bits are tight and the right bits are relaxed. When it's out of rhythm, it looks wooden and clunky. It doesn't look right. And seeing people in rhythm normally is when they're starting to, I would say, express themselves, the version they have of themselves, and make an impact on the game. And often that is what makes people hard to play against, because other people can't quite understand how is this guy or woman staying relaxed in a situation where they should be under pressure.
Before we come to you on that one, Chris, just Peter, one thing, it makes me think that some of your descriptions there were, I do wonder in sports sometimes if coaches, and this wasn't your description, Peter, but go with me on this one, conflate mindset and strategy. And what I heard from you trying to get across there is, I think you said about batting for time. Like you could potentially have a conservative strategy, but you can actually play front foot. You can play positively. You can play to win, I suppose. And you know, my background, I was in golf, a professional golfer, and one of the biggest influences on my early playing career was Dr. Bob Rotella in his first book, Golf is Not a Game of Perfect. And one of the best chapters is Conservative Strategy, Cocky Swing, which is a wonderful, here's that word again, dichotomy, where we dichotomize, we separate strategy and mindset. Well, I can take an iron off the tee rather than a driver off the tee, but I'm still going to swing with a sense of cockiness, with a sense of confidence. And it's helping coaches understand that we can, in football, we can set up conservatively, defensively, but we can still play on that front foot. And that's maybe that's a challenging picture for people to actually expose themselves to.
No, it makes complete sense, really. You've got to, coming back to Chris's stay in the moment, you play the situation in front of you, and each situation in sport throws up a tactic often that will be the best strategy to take on at that time. We see it in cricket all the time, certainly in longer format. Sometimes attack is the best strategy, even in a tight situation, depending on what skill set you've got as a player. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. Sometimes to be conservative and hold on to what you've got is the best strategy. And it can be done with a mindset, knowing that you're doing it with an outcome that is to win the game in the long run.
Nice, good. And Chris, this just comes back to you, as you say, playing in the moment.
I think what I will say, and it alluded to it, but we touched on it earlier when I talked about our fast bowling coach delivers better mental skills than me, is that cricket has had a really good history of sports psychology. I actually felt I've been in some environments that have been quite wary of psychology to start off with, just because the history hasn't quite been there. Yet, when I walked into England cricket for the first time in 2013, they'd had about 4 psychologists before me over the 20 years that preceded me. So walking in there was like, oh, great, we've got another psychologist. It was just a normal thing, which is why I look at all of the coaches, especially in cricket, that I work with. And it's growing, by the way, into all of the sports far more better now than I think it was 10, 15 years ago, who are curious about the psychological skills. So in my world, they're with them every single net session, every single time that they are doing something. They need to be good at this. So working closely with the specialist coaches to help them understand how to actually build a routine with somebody, the pet-lep approach of visualization, how it fits, how it works, teaching that stuff. I said earlier, huge enjoyment from knowing that is being delivered on a daily basis on the days that I'm not here, because the coaching staff just do it brilliantly.
Brilliant. Well, gents, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. Absolutely fascinating. Brilliant to hear how you work together and drive psychology at Notts Cricket Club. Chris, you've got your own private company. How can people find you on social media and find, I'm assuming you've got a website, find you online?
Yeah, no, I don't have a website actually, Dan. That's definitely something I probably
Okay.
I probably should sort myself out with. Twitter is definitely the best place to find me, at CK Marshall. If anyone's got any questions, that definitely is the best place to get me. But I've typically or historically flown under the radar, Dan, if I'm honest, and I quite like it that way. So yeah, that's the best place to get hold of me.
Well, you've flown under the radar, but you've had some big positions, mate. So it speaks to the quality of your work. So thank you so much to both of you. Peter, can't thank you enough, and wonderful to meet you. Thank you for both your time today.
Thanks for having
Cheers,
me.
Dan. Cheers, Dan.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.